Hi everybody, my name is Liana Gordon. I recently gave a speech at Halton Alive's annual Gala fundraiser event, and I had a lot of requests to film my speech in order to make it easier for those of you who watched and enjoyed it to share it with friends and family, and perhaps take a couple of notes down along the way. I briefly shared my testimony and the observations that I have as a young individual in the pro-life movement concerning my transition from a pro-choice, secular advocate of the woman's right to choose to a pro-life advocate and defender of the unborn. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Liana Gordon. I'm a student at Tyndale University, a Christian institution based in Toronto, Canada, and I'm also a pro-life advocate. As I stand here and I list all of these qualities and traits that identify me, I'm sure that it might come as a shock to many of you. That is, there doesn't seem to be many young female pro-life advocates in Canada. This fact is what inspired me to come here today and speak before you all. While it is true that there is a scarcity of like-minded young women in the Halton region, organizations like Halton Alive, I believe, represent the very last vestiges of common sense rationality in a dying culture like ours. Thus, I came to speak on behalf of my generation. I hope to highlight the importance and impact organizations like Halton Alive have had on my life and the hopeful future of pro-life activism in a culture that has embraced its very opposite. I believe the most pressing issue in our day and age is the failure of Western education. As a student, my perspective on contentious moral issues is often directly informed by my education. For most of my life, I have been surrounded by modern schoolrooms. Now, as a student receiving a classical liberal arts education at a Christian institution, I can speak for myself in saying that the chasm between the two systems is shocking. I ultimately found that at the heart of commonly accepted liberal dogma was not tolerance, acceptance, and diversity, but a fundamental degradation of human life. This is done through the implementation of what I like to call the mechanistic worldview, in which human life is nothing more than the byproduct of determined biochemical processes, and in which all moral questions can be settled by the objective dictums of science and its peddlers. One of the best summaries of this worldview is given in New York Times bestseller book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, a book many young people like myself have read and been influenced by. In it, author Yuval Noah Harari states, "As far as we can tell from a purely scientific viewpoint, human life has absolutely no meaning. Humans are the outcome of blind evolutionary processes that operate without goal or purpose. Our actions are not part of some divine cosmic plan, and if planet Earth were to blow up tomorrow morning, the universe would probably keep going about its business as usual. As far as we can tell at this point, human subjectivity would not be missed. Hence, any meaning that people inscribe to their lives is just a delusion." In other words, life is completely meaningless. Ideas about human rights, human dignity, the value of friendship, of truth, of beauty and love, all are reduced to fantasies of the human imagination. This rejection of the intrinsic value of human life manifests itself most obviously through the state's endorsement of abortion and doctor-assisted suicide. Today, many people are familiar with the cultural phenomenon known as assisted suicide, although it is most commonly referred to through the euphemistic terminology of euthanasia, the etymology of which comes from the Greek words for good and death. However, many people are unaware of the fact that abortion, as we know it today, finds its roots in a movement that dons a similar name: eugenics. Greek words in eugenics can be translated to good birth or good genes, good birth and good death. But who exactly gets to determine the definition of good? Groups of unelected official experts who use science to justify their political action. However, while euphemism serves an effective tool for softening the cold morality of scientifically determined societies, some activists on the other side are more blunt. In fact, one feminist pro-abortion activist named Camille Paglia came under fire from her community in recent years for publishing an op-ed in which she clearly states, "I have always frankly admitted that abortion is murder. the extermination of the powerless by the powerful. Liberals, for the most part, have shrunk from facing the ethical consequences of their embrace of abortion, which results in the annihilation of concrete individuals and not just clumps of cells. Hold on. You mean to tell me that abortion kills real, living human beings and not just clumps of cells? Yes, Paglia maintains, abortion is murder. However, she says, it is justified murder. It is a sacrifice at the altar of women's rights and autonomy. If you aren't already convinced of the utter pervasiveness of this ideology and its long-term implications for Canadian society, allow me to bring to light new and potential legislation that will likely color and determine the shape of our nation's future. Leftist degradation of human life cannot hide under the guise of euphemism for long. Soon, the slippery slope pro-life activists are accused of committing when arguing contra abortion and euthanasia will become a political reality, and it is happening right under our noses. For example, the Canadian government recently amended revisions to MAID, Canada's euthanasia program. Revisions to MAID have made it so that several safeguards that were previously in place no longer exist. For the longest time, advocates for euthanasia maintained that the procedure was reserved as an act of mercy for those suffering from irremediable conditions and who were facing a foreseeable and inevitable death. Now, death no longer needs to be reasonably foreseeable. In fact, anyone with any physical condition can apply for doctor-assisted suicide. And as of March 2023, this will also be extended to those suffering from mental illness. So, the government expresses support for international holidays that raise awareness for suicide prevention, but is also willing to fund and be complicit in the death of its own citizens. Even more disturbing is the fact that recently a group of physicians in Quebec suggested that euthanasia should be extended to newborns up to age 1 for those suffering severe disability or illness. But how long before this also gets extended to newborns suffering any kind of condition? Or how long before infanticide is justified on the basis of the economic or psychological worries of the parent? The ideological groundwork for this hypothetical reality has already been set and accepted in academia. In 2012, two philosophers published a paper entitled After-Birth Abortion, Why Should the Baby Live?, in which they defended the moral permissibility of infanticide. They maintained that any reason that would justify abortion should also justify infanticide. This isn't a slippery slope. This isn't emotional pleading or fear-mongering. This is a genuine assessment of the current state of our culture and an informed prediction about where it may be heading. This is why the work of organizations such as Halton Alive is so important. Activism is important because education is important. And in an age where virtually all education is dictated and organized by the state and its political incentives, the existence and voices of dissident opinions is absolutely crucial to breaking through the narrative. Another thing, the scientifically planned society operates from the ground up. I recently read a book by Belgian psychologist Matthias Desmet, in which he claims that, surprisingly, totalitarianism is a system that thrives on the codependency of the masses and its leaders. The complacency of the crowd is integral to the survival of a totalitarian state, and it is primarily achieved through education. For most of my life, school had taught me certain non-negotiable beliefs. Abortion was a woman's right, people had a right to die, all identities were valid, and moral beliefs were opinions, not fact. It had taught me to trust the supreme voice of science and to dismiss my own moral convictions as mere emotional bias. I listened to one voice, the crowd, and the opinions that had directly informed it. I was turned into the perfect consumer, the ideal voter. As Hannah Arendt once said, the aim of totalitarian education has never been to install conviction, but to destroy the capacity to form any. It is hard when you are in the midst of it to realize that you are being fed propaganda. A lie would not be considered a good lie unless it was convincing. And convinced I was. What, you may ask, tore me out of the tight grip of the narrative promoted by most schoolrooms? What had turned an individual like me, who saw no intrinsic value to human life, into an advocate for the unborn and the sick and the elderly who feel they do not have a voice? French sociologist Gustave Le Bon, who famously wrote his book, The Crowd, The Study of the Popular Mind, made an interesting observation about the behavior of large masses of people who are utterly convinced of their cause. Dissident voices apparently played a large role in reducing the depth of the crowd's hypnosis. For me, the emergence of dissident voices was an integral part of being woken up from the grip of the crowd. Once, a group of pro-life activists visited my high school. Their aim was to engage with students and challenge hidden assumptions they had about the value of human fetal life. The response from my classmates, however, was appalling. While the pro-life activists remained peaceful, level-headed, and kept their arguments centered on reason rather than emotional pleading, my peers had gathered around them in groups, yelling with raised fists, swearing at them, and refusing to engage in any rational dialogue. I remember feeling so convinced merely through that display of activism, of the integrity of the pro-life cause. And it wasn't just the arguments that had convinced me, but their demeanor. It broke through, even if only briefly, the illusion of the unquestionable truth of the grand narrative. It is the existence of opposition, thus, that breaks through the echo chambers of the totalitarian hive mind. We, as an organization and as well as people, are not here because it is some hobby. We are not here primarily because it offers a pleasant distraction and nice food or drinks. The main reason why we are pro-life, the main reason why we are activists is because it is our moral and democratic duty. The necessity of activism was expertly highlighted by author G.K. Chesterton, an English writer, philosopher, and Christian apologist, in his book Eugenics and Other Evils, A Case Against the Scientifically Planned Society. In his book, Eugenics and Other Evils, A Case Against the Scientifically Organized State, he states, "The wisest thing in the world is to cry out before you are hurt. It is no good to cry out after you are hurt, especially after you are mortally hurt. People talk about the impatience of the populace, but sound historians know that most tyrannies have been possible because men moved too late. It is often essential to resist a tyranny before it exists." Halton Alive is that resistance. While lots of our work is done in smaller communities, its impact is often unseen, but extremely important. Although small communities, suburbias house and foster growing children. As an environment for elementary education, suburbia is thus a microcosmic picture of society as a whole. The impact of Halton Alive and organizations like it is thus monumental. If we can contribute to an environment of open dialogue, of more love and more community, we would be cutting through a public discourse that is often more concerned with political correctness than it is truth. If we can share the light of Christ to a dark and dying culture, then we would be impacting society from the ground up. Halton Alive starts at the roots, and it aims to plant seeds that will ultimately grow up to be the lawyers, politicians, academics, and voters that ultimately shape our society back to its Christian foundation, back to a time in which life is protected rather than destroyed.